Welcome to another Royal Air Force Museum virtual lecture. This lecture is co-organised and co-hosted with the Lancaster University History Department's Centre for War and Diplomacy and forms part of the museum's broader research programme. Today's lecture will be hosted by Professor Marco Wyss, Director of the Centre for War and Diplomacy and Professor in International History and Security at Lancaster University. Throughout the lecture, be sure to use the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of your screen to ask Bettina questions to be answered after the talk during the Q&A. So now please join me in welcoming Marco to the screen, and he will introduce our speaker.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Sam, and thank you very much for broadly outlining what this lecture series is about. It's a really nice partnership that's now running for a couple of years between the Centre for War and Diplomacy and the Royal Air Force Museum. So on behalf of the Centre, I really would like to say that we're absolutely delighted to be running this lecture series in partnership with the RAF Museum, and of course, particularly to host this very talk by Professor Bettina Renz. Before actually I introduce the speaker, let me say very few things about the Centre for War and Diplomacy. So Centre for War and Diplomacy is an interdisciplinary or rather multidisciplinary centre too that looks at war and diplomacy from the ancient period to today to inform current strategic debates. It's based in the History Department at Lancaster, but it's a faculty centre that brings together from colleagues from a number of disciplines, has honour researchers, a flourishing cohort of doctoral students, and also welcomes visiting scholars from across the world. In addition to research and engagement activities, we also are the intellectual home to two MAs, notably the MA in International and Military History and the MA in War and Diplomacy. So if you're interested, feel free to reach out. Applications for these programs are currently open. Now, moving on to tonight's talk. So it's really my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Bettina Renz. Bettina is Professor of International Security at the University of Nottingham School of Politics and International Relations. She completed her PhD in Russian and East European Studies at the University of Birmingham, and her research expertise is in Russian defense and security policy, with a particular interest in military modernization. She has published widely on the subject, including in her latest monograph, Russia's Military Revival, which, for those of you interested in buying it, appeared in 2018, published by Polity. Before her appointment at Nottingham, Bettina Renz worked as a lecturer in air power studies for King's College London at the RAF College Cranwell. She was also distinguished visiting professor at the Canadian Forces College in Toronto in 2020. Professor Renz is certainly one of the leading experts on Russian defense and security, and I'm thus very happy that you will be giving to us a talk today entitled, "Why did the West overestimate Russian military capabilities, and why does it matter?" In light of what has happened in Ukraine, I think we are all very much looking forward to her talk and also, of course, her answer to her own question. So thank you very much for giving this talk for the CWD RAF Museum Lecture Series, Bettina. And please, the floor, or rather the screen, is yours.
Thank you very much for the very generous introduction. It's a pleasure to be invited to give this lecture. I've watched quite a few of the online lectures also during lockdown and so on, so I'm pleased to be able to speak myself. Of course, I would have loved to come to Lancaster. Unfortunately, it wasn't possible this time. So as Marco already said, my research over the last 20 years has been on the Russian military, on all aspects thereof. So I'm not a technology expert. I look at the political aspects of military power, first of all. And the issue I'm looking at today, of course, it's roughly the 1-year anniversary of the war in Ukraine just passed. There are many things to be said about the war in Ukraine, about Russian performance there, about future prospects or Ukrainian capabilities as well. But I decided to focus on one of the big questions that have been arising since the war started, the question of Western estimations of Russian military capabilities. Marco, Sam, please, can we start with the first slide? Great, thank you very much. So as everybody remembers probably from last year, US and UK military intelligence services accurately predicted the Russian invasion of Ukraine on 24th February 2022. There was no longer any doubt that a large-scale invasion would happen, so it didn't come as a surprise from this point of view. Where forecasts were less accurate, however, and where a lot of people were surprised, were about the performance of the Russian armed forces in this particular conflict. In particular, the recognition that although the Russian military had been, especially since the annexation of Crimea in 2014, studied widely, there was perception that Russia had caught up in many ways and had largely modernized its armed forces. The pretty dire performance came as a surprise to many in the West. So what happened was blunder after blunder. Some had expected initially a quick military victory, and this, of course, did not happen, and we are far from that. Now, this then led to quite a lot of soul searching about what had happened. Why did the West overestimate Russian military capabilities in this sense? As you can see there on the slide, Rasmussen, the former NATO Secretary General, in June 2022, in a speech, spoke about this fact and admitted that, well, we clearly have overestimated the strength of the Russian military. And then questions started being asked, like, is this really the Russian military that we thought we were looking at and studying for the last 3 years? And why did we get it so wrong? When it comes to functional military power, is the Russian military really a paper tiger? Can you move on to the next slide, please? Thank you. So why is this a problem? Of course, this then has been discussed widely. There's a perception that there is an intelligence gap, that this kind of misestimation of an adversary or potential adversary's military capabilities just shouldn't happen. There were discussions very quickly then that this overestimation of Russia came as a serious price to Ukraine in particular. The consideration that if Russian military capabilities had been seen in a more realistic way, then perhaps there would have been the assumption that Ukraine could defeat Russia, and maybe more equipment would have been delivered to Ukraine by Western partners earlier and in bigger volumes. Of course, the fact that Russian military capabilities were overestimated to that extent also then play into fears about how are other potential adversary estimated. So China and other countries, if we are unable to get these basics right, essentially, this could be, of course, a security issue in the future. So as a result, then, there have been calls for better future military assessments, discussions in the US, also in the UK, and amongst NATO, that this needs to be improved, and that there will be certain reviews as the war goes on, or once the war is completed, about how this was got so wrong and how this should improve in the future. Next slide, please. Now, fingers were quickly pointed then in the search for who is to blame for these overestimates at Western military analysts, Western analysts with an expertise in the Russian armed forces. And a variety of military analysts or commentators gave some reasons in their view for why the military capabilities of Russia were overestimated. I won't read out all of those quotes there. This is just a selection of the kind of accusations or criticism that was made. The idea that, well, most professional scholars of the Russian military predicted falsely a quick and decisive victory, mostly on the basis of overestimating material capabilities, essentially. And Phillips O'Brien, he's a professor of war studies at St. Andrews University, saying it's embarrassing really for Western experts that just went on about Russian military modernization and so on, focusing on the glamour of war and being blinded in a way by technology and so on, and getting it wrong as a result. Now, these are quite strong criticisms. Of course, as a Western expert on the Russian military myself, I took note of that. And these critics also suggested some solutions, which I would say the conventional wisdom about the solution. On the next slide, please. So the suggestion then is by those critics that the overestimates of Russian military capabilities are due to the focus by experts on basic metrics, counting tanks, essentially, planes, and rhapsodizing on their technical specifications. And their solution then, or their suggestion, is that simply we need better military analysts, better experts that look at military capabilities in much more nuance and a more in-depth way. So they suggested that a much wider range of factors needs to be taken into account in order to estimate a country's real or actual military capabilities, which go beyond just the availability of certain technology. So logistics, of course, what has been a massive problem when it came to Russian operations. Morale, of course, a major problem on the Russian side, whereas it was much stronger on the Ukrainian side, as initially anticipated, problems with leadership. Corruption, of course, being endemic in Russia and the Russian military defense industry, and so on. And also, of course, the capabilities of the opponent, Russia's opponent, in this case, Ukraine. So all of these need to be considered for more accurate future assessments and predictions. Now, this sounds quite convincing in many ways. But as I argue, and this is the next slide where I present you my argument that I will take you through, it is not that simple. In many ways, this idea that technology alone does not give us an insight into a country's military capabilities, well, this is not a new insight. And also the understanding that other factors are important. This is something that we have known for a long time. There is quite a lot of research on that. But nonetheless, so far, military analysts looking at various capabilities, maybe potentially future outcomes of wars, have been unable to come up with accurate predictions. And the reasons for these are quite complex, and this is what my talk is all about. So my argument is, and this also goes along with Richard Betts, who is an intelligence expert who already wrote in 1978, this idea that better military forecasts of outcomes of war or capabilities can be done by just having better analysts, or this idea that simply improving the analytical base will lead to accurate predictions is actually illusory and also dangerous, because it can instill overconfidence that reforms like that, simple reforms, will increase the predictability of threats, which are and often are, almost all of the time, as you will see, are in many ways unpredictable. So my argument is that there should not be knee-jerk reactions, finger pointing, or indeed the idea that this is something that can be easily resolved in the future. It doesn't mean that the work by Western experts on the Russian military is beyond criticism, of course not. And some self-reflection is, of course, absolutely merited. But there is no simple solution. And I'm offering here, as an area expert, both of Russia, but also somebody who is from a disciplinary background, trained in strategic studies, I offer 3 debates that I will take stock of in my talk that will give us a deeper insight into why Russian military capabilities were overestimated and the kind of lessons we can learn from this, and to what extent actually improvement will be possible in the future. The first point, the first debate I will be looking at are prevailing Western narratives about Russia more broadly. How is Russia seen as a country, as a potential adversary, the Russian leadership, and so on. Secondly, I will look at the debate, and there is an academic literature on this, on how military capabilities should be measured. And there are certain reasons for why material assets are often overestimated, but also factors why this is kind of inevitable. And finally, then looking at more strategic studies debate, the question about can outcomes of war actually be predicted? And the question to that, I spoil it for you already, is no. There is no such thing as a simply or universally good military. Understanding capabilities, even in nuance, will not make it easy to predict outcomes in war, because that depends on strategy, the opponent, and many other factors that are often unknowable and unpredictable at the time. So let me start with the first debate I'm looking at on the next slide. These are the prevailing Western narratives about Russia. There has been, since the 1990s, and this also was a case during the Cold War, a certain degree of hyperbole in viewing Russian military capabilities in the West, especially by policy and decision makers. In the 1990s, in particular, very little attention was paid to the Russian military at all. There was the perception of the Cold War was won by the West. Russia is no longer a global actor. Of course, Russia spent very little money on its military, comparatively speaking, during the 1990s. What happened then was the eye was taken off the ball, not necessarily by analysts. Quite a lot of them, including myself, kept their eyes on the ball and continued studying the Russian military. But by policy and decision makers, this just no longer was seen as a particularly important issue. This meant then that the annexation of Crimea, which was a strategic success and operationally well conducted by Russia, came as a massive surprise to many in the West. And this was not because there was a sudden turnaround in Russian capabilities. In fact, Russian military reforms had been ongoing for quite a long time at this point and had accelerated significantly since 2008. It was more or less self-inflicted, the surprise. And as a result, there was a degree of overcorrection then by Western decision makers and policy makers, leading to a very unhelpful hyperbole about Russian military decay first until 2014, and then ascendance. Up until the annexation of Crimea, in fact, I was at a workshop, for example, at the NATO Defense College a few months before the annexation of Crimea. And this workshop was called Does Russia Matter? And the conclusion of this workshop or the conference, and this is available online, the conclusion basically concluded that Russia was no longer an important actor. It was not a threat or a partner for the West because of the decay of its military forces. Now, this then flipped almost overnight into a quite extreme overestimation of Russian military capabilities. And this was not driven by Western military analysts who had continued studying the Russian armed forces. And they warned at the time, there are a lot of quotes and a lot of work on this, that now overestimation of Russian capabilities were a greater danger. There were parliamentary inquiries and a lot of discussion that Russia in 2014 was on the way, more or less, of overtaking the West in terms of conventional military capabilities, which is not really something that what Russia did in Crimea allowed us to conclude. The operation in Crimea was very limited. There was hardly any actual military force used. So this did not allow for any conclusions about conventional military capabilities. The hype about Russian military ascendance and increasing conventional capabilities then, of course, was supported also by the Russian airstrikes in Syria. But again, these were quite limited. There were limited airstrikes. Western military analysts pointed out that from a technological point of view, even the Russian advancement in technology made it comparable perhaps to what the United States and coalition partners had in the first Gulf War. So quite a bit behind in that respect. And again, the operations in Crimea did not allow for any conclusions about Russian capabilities to fight large combined arms operations. Also, a lot of work was carried out up until 2022 about problems with the Russian defense industry, including corruption, the lack of capability of the Russian defense industry to innovate, problems with developing new platforms, and so on. Also, some of the more hyperbolic ideas about Russian cyber warfare. This is everything that Western military experts warned against. So there was quite a lot of nuance actually available. But again, this then did not fit into this overcorrection by Western policy and decision makers. And this was supported even by a certain tendency of orientalizing Russia, I would call it. So making Russia look, and this goes back to the Cold War, making Russia look like this mystical country that cannot be properly understood, like the riddle wrapped in an enigma. and so on. And because it is so difficult to understand Russia, the idea that this is what makes it particularly dangerous. And some other quite orientalizing views really on Russia. Here are the Russians 10 feet tall, the idea that the Russians and President Putin in particular are playing chess, whereas the West is playing checkers, and so on. Next slide, please. And this way of portraying Russia, or portraying the Russian leadership and Putin and so on in ways that exceeded any realistic assessment of how the Russian military had developed and what Russia could achieve, was particularly evident in the discussions of Russian hybrid warfare capabilities, especially after the annexation of Crimea. So this idea that without even shooting or using any military force or a single shot fired, Russia was able to use hybrid warfare tactics, information, psychological pressure, and so on to annex the Crimea. And again, the fear then that this is something where Russia could outdo the West, is something where Russia had overtaken the West. And again, this in particular, and I also wrote about that myself in a critical way, was not a narrative that was driven by Western analysts of the Russian military. Quite the opposite. Actually, a lot of us, and there are quite a few names out there, got distracted by this focus, or in the media and in the Western imagination and by policymakers, about the assumed Russian hybrid warfare capabilities, trying to correct this record, but not really being listened to, essentially. So all this work about the Gerasimov doctrine, Russian information warfare capabilities, and so on, was looked at in a very critical way. But this did not really manage to enter official discourse and the public imagination. And again, a lot of writing that we cannot read anything into assumed Russian hybrid warfare capabilities from the annexation of Crimea. Whole books were written about the fact that hybrid warfare is not something actually that is embedded in Russian military thinking. It was a label imposed actually by the West onto Russia with hindsight, that the success in Crimea was highly circumstantial. So it made Russia and Putin in particular look stronger than it is. And the information warfare discussion in particular, again, really overestimated what Russia was able to do militarily. So the Crimea annexation was called by a NATO official at the time as the most amazing information blitzkrieg operation in history. The idea that what Russia managed in Crimea with information could be repeated elsewhere. These fears were then underlined by the Russian meddling, political meddling in the US 2016 presidential elections in particular, where a lot was written about what Russia did and the kind of social media and other information channels they used. But as pointed out by many experts, the actual effects of these were more assumed often than actually proven. And the idea that Russia and Putin, the so-called strategic genius, could influence other societies, the Western societies, the US, and so on, politically in that way, using information to achieve very specific outcomes, really belies anything we know and that's available in the literature about information operations, which are extremely difficult, as the West, as we know ourselves from attempts to win hearts and minds and so on elsewhere. It requires an in-depth knowledge of other societies, a depth and level of intelligence that is very rarely available. It also belied anything we knew about Russian intelligence services at the time and still now, which are highly corrupt and, of course, highly personalized, and very much the understanding that there was a tendency really of intelligence agencies to tell Putin what he wanted to hear rather than what the situation really was like. But again, these critical approaches were not taken into account by policy and decision makers that got carried away with this idea of Russian information warfare capabilities and so on. And as we saw in Ukraine, of course, this level of intelligence, insight, and understanding of other societies that this implies is not something that the Kremlin leadership has at all. Intelligence failures were one of the major reasons why Russia did so poorly, where they assumed more or less the Ukrainians would greet the Russians with flowers, that the government would give in quickly, and Russia could just install a pro-Russian government very quickly in Ukraine. So this prevailing narrative by policy and decision makers in the West just became impervious to reasonable challenge by Western military analysts. And this idea by February 2022 that Russia could not but win the war in Ukraine quickly was unimaginable to many as a result. Now moving on to the second to the second narrative, or the second debate I want to look at, which is the debate over how to measure military power. And there are various points here. As I already mentioned at the beginning, this idea that so-called non-tangible factors are important, like morale, leadership, command and control, maybe also anti-corruption and so on. In order to estimate military capabilities, these are not a new insight. And there are discussions going all the way back in the 1960s already, where analysts looking at the Soviet military at the time said exactly that same thing. And many very prominent experts, Stephen Biddle, also Risa Brooks, wrote a seminal work on estimating or creating military power, the source of military effectiveness, have written about this, about the different factors that are important to bear in mind when we try to estimate military power. And Western experts on the military, and in fact also Western policy and decision makers, are well aware that these things are important. So during the 1990s, if you read or what was written about the Russian military at the time, it was all about corruption and the problems of that, about civil-military relations, the need for a more democratic system of civilian control, about problems with the defense industry, about lack of morale, poor living standards and payment and so on in the armed forces. So a lot of understanding that this is really what matters for a functioning military. In 2008, then Russia embarked on the so-called Serdyukov reforms, the defense minister at the time, a serious program of military modernization, where for the first time since the 1990s, then also a lot of money was spent on the armed forces. And there was a systematic attempt for structural reform, so moving from divisions to brigades and decreasing the officer corps, trying to recruit more professional soldiers, so Russia would no longer have to rely on conscription to that respect. And this, of course, was studied by Western analysts. So this then led to a greater focus on technology. Naturally, what happened during the 1990s in Russia was that basically no new kit was procured. And for those of you interested in air power, during the 1990s, the Russian military, up until 2008, more or less, the Russian armed forces and the Air Force in particular, received hardly any new kit, any new aircraft at all. Now, this modernization program was accompanied by a very costly rearmament program, which then meant that money was again expended on buying new kit, on developing new platforms and so on. And as such, of course, this was a notable development that was deserving of study. It was an absolutely legitimate area of inquiry. It is not so much the problem that people studied this technology, it's more than what those that matter, policy and decision makers, make of it. But in general, in the past, so this has been a long ongoing debate and long ongoing criticism that military assessments, intelligence assessments, over-focus on material assets, on numbers of soldiers, and in particular, technology. And there are some reasons for this. Like, first of all, these things are, of course, much easier to quantify and are therefore preferred in terms of studying. It is clear, and everybody will understand that issues such as morale of soldiers, leadership, and so on are absolutely essential for military capabilities. But that doesn't mean that these things can be easily studied, especially in a country like Russia. So getting information on corruption in the armed forces or about morale of soldiers will be difficult to come by in any country. and in particular in Russia, and even more particularly so over the last 10, 15 years, where access by Western analysts to Russian military data and information has been very, very difficult. And of course, also factors like morale, for example, and leadership are dynamic and contingent. They are not an absolute issue that can just be studied as an absolute. For example, when it came to the annexation of Crimea or Russian airstrikes in Syria, morale, leadership, command and control were not an issue until all of a sudden they were when it came to the invasion of Ukraine or the reinvasion of Ukraine in 2022. So it's one thing to acknowledge that these things are important, but it's quite another thing then to know how to study these, and in particular, then how to combine all of these different factors into a picture that would allow us to see or to anticipate how they would play out in a particular warfare scenario. The Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet Union is a case in point here. Now, there also Western experts were criticized at the time for not having predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, the issue was not that there hadn't been any studies of weaknesses of the Soviet Union, of the economy, of nationalism in the Soviet Union, and so on. But it's one thing to know of these different weaknesses, but quite another thing then to combine them into predicting, in this case, the fall of the Soviet Union. And the same also will be true of a warfare scenario. Now, I know a lot of people here are interested in air power, so I have one slide specifically on that, which is my next slide. Of course, especially when it comes to air power studies or literature on air power, there is a tendency to focus or over-focus really on technological issues. One thing that came as a particular surprise to many was the extremely poor performance of the Russian Air Force in the initial stages of the war, but also until today. And this was, well, in spite of the fact that by any measurements, really, the Russian Air Force was technologically and numerically far superior to the Ukrainian Air Force at the time. But of course, as we have seen in the past, and also a lot of the air power literature is about that, this idea that technological perfectibility or perfect air power cannot win a war on its own, or is no guarantee for winning a war, of course, also relates to Russia. And there are many issues really we can look at then for why the Russian Air Force performed so poorly. Technological superiority, of course, cannot make up for strategic failures. And as I already mentioned, the sort of lack of a very poor intelligence, this idea basically that the Ukrainians would give in quickly and that Russia could just walk into Ukraine basically and achieve their objectives within a matter of few days played into this. So it was a matter of hubris. There were evidently not even any plans to achieve air superiority at the time. So it was a strategic failure, at least initially, as much as a problem with technology. But also people have looked at doctrines and Russian exercises and so on, and the air power thinking and what air power is used for in conventional warfighting differ considerably in Russia as well. So first of all, technologically, there are problems or poor capabilities for suppressing enemy air defenses by Russia, but also activities or tasks or tactics like close air support is not something really that is deeply embedded or has ever been prioritized by the Russian Air Force as such. Although we knew about how many new aircraft Russia had, and most of them were legacy systems, of course, at the time, there was no evidence really for how prepared Russia was to use these air assets in large combined air operations, large combined arms operations. And especially the jointness or the idea of joint warfare is not something that is that far developed in Russia. Also, there are issues that were well known up until then, and people had written about it. Problems with pilot training, for example. Although this had improved from the 1990s, still Russian Air Force pilots have a lot fewer flying hours than their Western counterparts. and of course flying legacy systems. So the Russian military, the Russian Air Force modernized its armed forces in the sense that they bought new aircraft, but they were new in the sense that they had been updated or were newly built models of older Cold War legacy systems, essentially. There was a lot of discussion and a lot of then emphasis in the West also of Russian attempts to develop a new 5th generation fighter and hypersonic capabilities and so on. But all of this, of course, was not something that characterized the Russian Air Force as a whole. And then last but not least, when in people's attempts to explain why the Russian Air Force did so poorly, also about what kind of war Russia is fighting. I'm not sure whether I'm 100% behind this kind of explanation. So this explanation goes as follows. From the Russian point of view, Russia in Ukraine is not fighting a war against the Ukrainians only or against the Ukrainian people. It is part of a wider effort, wider war, if you want, from the Russian point of view against the West. So some people assume, and actually some people who know quite a lot about the Russian military and armed forces, that perhaps there is a reluctance really to use up all the best efforts in this particular operation, the special military operations, as the Russians call it, rather than what might be required in a wider war with the West. But I'm not 100% convinced by this holding back scenario. Maybe we can discuss it later. Next slide, please. My last point then about how to measure military power is also about political advocacy and agenda. So it is not a problem if some analysts focus on military technology. This is obviously an important thing to study when we study Russian military or any other country's military capabilities. And you cannot understand capabilities without these kind of studies either. The problem is by what information is chosen and how the available data and information then is used by those who matters and actually make decisions that matter in real life. And the problem, of course, is that any available analysis is always interpreted in a politicized atmosphere, especially by politicians and decision makers. And the political context in which Russian military capabilities were overestimated before the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 really was very conducive to overestimating Russian military capabilities. So first of all, Crimea came as a surprise, as I already mentioned, which triggered a kind of worst case scenario approach, which is quite common in history of military and diplomatic relations, because of the understanding that underestimating an enemy can be even worse, or is actually the worst option, as Russia itself is finding out right now in the war against Ukraine. But also, and I put you two examples here on the side, the overestimation of Russian military capabilities up until 2022 came at a time where there was quite maybe a loss of confidence almost in Western military capabilities in the aftermath of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, a kind of crisis of confidence in the Western way of war. So Gian Gentile, it's a good book. I really enjoyed reading it quite a few years ago already, making the argument that Western military was in the process of losing the ability to fight heavy or fighting conventional military conflicts or large-scale conventional wars because of that decade-long focus on counterinsurgency and counter-terrorism operations. And David Kilcullen's bit more recent book, also enjoyable, although I don't agree with everything he wrote about, especially about Russia, this idea that the West was falling behind other countries like Russia and China in particular, who learned to fight the West by looking at these kind of weaknesses. And this then played into certain lobbying and political agendas. A lot of politicians, but also, of course, military practitioners and so on, calling for more expenditure on defense. A lot of discussions of NATO needs to spend more on defense, especially European NATO countries and so on. So overestimating Russian capabilities fitted into the political context at the time. And it just was not anticipated then at the time that this could have negative repercussions as well. So the problem is not that decision makers even, but also Western analysts do not realize that things other than technology matter. The problem is that these things are difficult to study on the one hand and to combine into a clearer picture, but also, of course, it is very unlikely that intelligence analysis like this or military estimates can be made on a completely unbiased basis where the political context of the time will not come into it. And I have got my last point now, so I know I only have a few minutes left, which is predicting outcomes in war on the next slide. So Western analysts of the Russian military were critiqued or criticized for the idea that their focus on technology and so on then fed into incorrect predictions of Russian military performance. But the problem with this criticism is that the quality of a military, as I mentioned earlier, just cannot be measured in an absolute sense. So there's no such thing as a universally good military, because context, of course, strategy in a war and so on matters. This means that victory and defeat in war are not only down to sheer military capabilities, but they're down largely to strategy, which is the achievement of the use of military means for the achievement of particular specific political purpose. So what worked for Russia, the capabilities that worked perfectly well in Crimea in 2014, of course, were completely irrelevant in 2022. This does not mean that the Russian military was better in 2014 or in Syria than it was in 2022, but the context was completely different. So, of course, the Kremlin expected a quick military victory in Ukraine in February 2022, but what it got as a result was an attrition war, and a war that has no end in sight. And this is, of course, not the first time in history that this happens, that military leaders leaderships start a war expecting a quick victory within a few days and then ending up with a long attritional war. So the idea that Western military analysts could have predicted the outcome of the war in Ukraine is unrealistic. And the idea that future wars outcomes can be predicted in general is very problematic, because these are two different things. We can talk about capabilities, but of course, how these capabilities work out in a particular war depend on more than just the capabilities themselves. Because nobody could know at the time what kind of war Putin would engage in Ukraine in 2022. It was clear that an invasion would occur, but it was not clear really what kind of strategy Putin would use to go about it. And if we look back into what Western experts had written about the war in Ukraine, nobody predicted confidently that Russia would defeat Ukraine or win in Ukraine within a matter of 2 or 3 days. There had been some scenarios, so nobody predicted an outcome there, but of course, think tanks and so on, also intelligence agencies engage in certain scenarios for future war scenarios. A lot of those at the time, though, had focused on the Baltic states, because this was seen as particularly problematic for the West, or was a security priority. And the outcomes of these scenarios, some of them have been published by the RAND Corporation, for example, were quite problematic and quite negative. The idea that NATO would not be able to easily defend its Baltic member states. Whether this is true or not, of course, we hopefully will never find out. But of course, if anybody made conclusions on the basis of this, of what would happen in Ukraine, this is hugely problematic, because the context is so different. There were some Western military analysts that expressed an opinion then, as it became clear that Russia was certainly going to do something in Ukraine about how this might pan out. And they also published these kind of results. But rather than predicting a quick victory in Ukraine, the conclusion by most Western military experts was that any scenario they could possibly envisage of how Russia might go about in an invasion of Ukraine simply didn't make sense, because they would be politically counterproductive. It would not be achievable, for example, to occupy Ukraine easily, and it would be very, very costly for Russia. So what Western experts got wrong was not so much that they overestimated Russian capabilities or thought that Russia would win quickly. It was more their inability to predict the kind of strategy Putin would go for that seemed in their eyes irrational at the time, and also, of course, from a strategic point of view, turned out to be irrational, as we can see now concerning how far Russia got in its particular war. Just very, very quickly, I know I'm out of time, so I'll just say 2 or 3 words about the final slide there. Of course, war is also a duel, and critics rightfully pointed out that a big mistake, it's the next slide, please. Yes, that one, thank you. That what was underestimated by Western military analysts was Ukrainian capabilities, Ukrainian will to resist, and so on. This is absolutely true. And yes, we cannot emphasize this enough. But of course, this is part of a much broader problem. It is not something that can be easily resolved. While there has been quite a strong narrative on Russia, which overestimated its capability when it comes to Ukraine, until 2022 in the West, there was basically no narrative at all. If there was any narrative about Ukraine, it was as a victim of Russian aggression and so on. And actually very little information was available on Ukraine, or very little interest really in studying Ukraine in more detail. There is hardly any data available on the Ukrainian military and its capabilities, because this is simply not something that many experts studied. And the idea that Western experts on the Russian military could have come up with this data or done these studies themselves is also laughable in a way, because as we discussed earlier, it is very, very complex to understand the country's military. It requires insight into society, culture, history, and so on. Language, of course, that experts of the Russian military simply do not have. So if we want more understanding of the Ukrainian military, it takes a much bigger approach. We need more area knowledge, languages that need to be taught. If already very few people speak Russian nowadays and studied at universities, the same is true, much more so for Ukrainian, which even during the Cold War was offered very, very rarely. So this would require changing education, also change of funding for what kind of research is being done. And of course, there will be more interest in Ukraine now, and this will be studied. But of course, this will not necessarily allow us to predict other future outcomes of potential Russian wars, because we also know very little about the Kazakh military, the Armenian military, and so on. Is the Russian military a paper tiger? Not much time to speak about this, but I think there is now again the danger to flip to the other extreme. Operational failures by Russia in the war against Ukraine really should not translate into the perception that Russia is no longer a country that should be feared, or that at least can cause an awful lot of problems to international security, to Ukraine at the moment still, first of all. So this idea that at the end of the day, what do we do with this understanding that the Russian military has performed worse than it actually did? There's still call for much more spending in the West, like Germany, for example, upping its military spending by hundreds of billions of pounds and so on. Obviously, this is because of Russia's doing. Also, of course, we shouldn't underestimate the extent to which what is happening in Ukraine is seen very, very differently in Russia than it is in the West. According to Putin, or in his mind, of course, still very important objectives are being achieved, even though the maximalist objectives of the war have not been achieved, which is occupying all of Ukraine. Russia is punishing Ukraine first of all. Russia also is standing up to the West as Russia sees it. And not all countries in the world are actually as critical of Russia. Some even like the idea that Russia is standing up against the West. So again, it is not seen as the loss by Russia as it is often portrayed nowadays. But I think now I really have to finish very briefly with my conclusion. So yes, the Russian military has been overestimated in the run-up to the invasion of Ukraine. But the situation is much more complex. It's not as simple as saying we need better experts, we need better analysts. Some improvements can be made, but the outcomes of that, especially in terms of predicting the outcomes of war, will be rarely limited. And I've got a nice quote there on the very final conclusion slide, as Lawrence Friedman wrote in his book about the future of war. The inability to predict future wars, the biggest surprises in war often lie in what happens after the first engagements. And I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Bettina. I know I've got loads of questions, and I'm sure the audience does. I mean, they've already asked quite a few in the Ask a Question feature. So I'm going to welcome Marco back to the screen, and he's going to lead on the Q&A section. So if you've got any more questions, feel free to use the Ask a Question button. But Marco, take it away.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much, Bettina, for this really fascinating talk and very nuanced and not, unnecessarily critical because, of course, it's such a conundrum, the Russian defeat. But, of course, also military assistance is interesting, of course, that was offered to Ukraine. And indeed, there's also very little analysis on Ukraine, of course, before the invasion. But anyway, I will not try to monopolize the floor, although I will have plenty of questions to you, and I will sort of try to take the questions in as much as I can in chronological order, I mean, the way when they were asked, but also taking into account the votes. But starting now with the first one I see is by Jeff Allen Wardle about the question, do we know why the Russian Air Force has been so ineffective?
Yeah, I mean, I had a slide on that, so I don't know if that question was typed out before I spoke about it.
It was typed out before, from what I remember, but perhaps
I can elaborate a little bit. So, like I said, I don't buy into this idea that Russia could do a lot better if they wanted to, but they're saving their best assets and so on because they never know what happens in the future, and their real worry is a war against the West. My assessment would be that they simply were unprepared. They don't know how to use, or they haven't trained really how to use the Air Force in such a large-scale war. Russia hasn't fought a large-scale war like this before. Russia has used its military quite extensively since the 1990s, first of all in Chechnya, of course, then in Syria and in some smaller sort of so-called peacekeeping operations. But this, of course, is a completely different scale. The Russians completely underestimated the Ukrainians, both in terms of capabilities, but also in terms of will to resist. So they simply were unprepared. This is a major ground war, of course, also. Ukraine is an extremely large country, one of the largest by territory in Europe. It has a population of 40 million people. Russia assumed that this would be the operation would be. There are indications, of course, we haven't seen any war plans, but there are assumptions that Russia thought they would get to Kiev within a matter of days and supplant the Ukrainian military within a couple of weeks with a pro-Russian government. And of course, if you work on this assumption, like a large, long-standing operation in this way just wasn't planned. I think hubris plays into it, complete underestimation of the Ukrainians, and the idea that a few airstrikes might be enough to bomb the Ukrainians into submission. I really have trouble understanding why how this intelligence failure was possible. So as a sort of, I started a project on Ukrainian military reforms, in fact, with a colleague who is a Ukraine expert in 2019. I did not work on Ukraine before that, so I'd only been to Ukraine about 3 or 4 times by the time the war started. But it was absolutely clear to me, who just had been to Ukraine a few times, that the Ukrainians would fight to the death, like essentially against the Russians. So how Russian intelligence could be based on, or how the Russian war could be based on such poor intelligence, it really, is absolutely incredible. But again, to do with the fact that obviously intelligence agencies had told Putin what he wanted to hear. But also, I think this sort of great power assumption, which I guess Russia, or this war, is not the only example where a country of the size of Russia in history just thinks, well, how can we not win again a smaller enemy, and then things turning out much worse than they would. Even if the Russian Air Force had done better, the war would not have been won. It would not have been a turning point, because again, what Russia wants, the assumption was that they would turn Ukraine into more or less a part of Russia with a compliant population that would be happy more or less to be Ukrainian only by name, if at all, or annex the whole of Ukraine. And of course, this just was never and never will be possible for Russia, no matter how good its air forces would have performed. We still don't have all the answers. I was at a week-long event last week or 2 weeks ago for the 1-year anniversary of the war in Ukraine, where again there are lots of also military practitioners and experts and so on. And the question of why the Russian Air Force performed quite so badly is still not resolved. I don't know if we'll ever find an answer. So it's a bit of a muddled response, but it's not down to technology. It's down to planning, doctrine, and strategy, first of all.
Thank you. Moving on to the next question by Bill Strandberg. Was the unit organization of the Russian forces, e.g. the lack of a non-commissioned officer corps, a major limitation of the ability to fight if the officers are killed or removed?
Yes, so obviously huge problems in terms of manpower, command and control. One thing, yes, that again, it shouldn't really have come as such a surprise, because the understanding that command and control, mission command and so on is important, is not a new insight, or it's not something we didn't know about. For some reason, some people took their eyes off the ball when it came to Russia. There was no reason to assume that Russian military units would work with initiative, the initiative required in a war of this scale. It was always unrealistic to assume that in a country that is as controlled and as authoritarian in Russia, the same would not be the case for the military. So it's of course impossible really to modernize the military in isolation from the wider developments in society and so on. Also, of course, there had been, I think the extent to which Russia had actually managed to professionalize its armed forces had also been overestimated. So the numbers went up. They never quite managed to get as many soldiers under contract rather than conscripts as they wanted to, but nonetheless, the percentage of that went up and up. But again, a lot of this was on the basis of very short-term contracts, where people, instead of being quite conscript for 2 years, basically signed a contract as a soldier for 2 years. This did not make for a professional military. The lack of an NCO corps, of course, has been long discussed in Russia. They never managed to overcome that. It also was discussed in Ukraine to a big extent with their military reforms, and there they made much more progress with that, of course, as a result of the NATO comprehensive assistance package for military reforms in Ukraine. And again, it seems like this really paid off for the Ukrainians in the longer term.
Thank you very much. I'll move to the next question by Mark Parry, which I think, if I understand it correctly, would like to briefly bring us to the Cold War. He's asking to go back to the Cold War and the hyperbole you cited. Could NATO have easily stopped a European invasion? And did the Russians, I mean, I think by this he means the Soviets, know this given their own knowledge of the reality of the capability, or is it whether they know it now? So don't entirely understand the question, which period it refers to, but I can read it again if that might help. Without commenting while reading, I think that might make things easier. To go back to the Cold War and the hyperbole you cited, could NATO have easily stopped a European invasion? And did the Russians know this given their own knowledge of the reality of their capability? So perhaps it's more related to...
I think I know what you mean, but my answer is I don't know. Could NATO have stopped a European invasion by Russia during the Cold War? It's quite a theoretical discussion, of course, whether conventionally that would have been possible. Of course, and this is, of course, still the issue with Russia today. We can talk about conventional military balances and so on. But of course, the matter of fact is, of course, that Russia has a very strong nuclear deterrent. And this was also the case during the Cold War. So if Russia had attempted a European invasion, a full-scale invasion of Europe during the Cold War, the question is, well, would this have ended in a nuclear war or not? I think both sides were aware of that. Again, if we believe in deterrence at all, then the Russians would have been as much afraid of a nuclear escalation at the time as the West would have been. So I think it's a very theoretical question. We will never find out because the Cold War is over. I mean, before the invasion of Ukraine happened, there were, like I mentioned before, a lot of scenarios about what would happen if Russia tried to invade the Baltic states and so on, push into NATO countries. And there was quite a lot of pessimism about this idea that Russia would get there quite quickly and NATO would struggle to defend the Baltic capitals and so on. But again, it's impossible to predict these things, how this really... And whether now, of course, people have changed their minds about it, I don't know. But of course, what is in everybody's mind is, and this is also, of course, why this war will go on or is happening the way it is in Ukraine, is that there is understandably a fear of a wider escalation, in particular nuclear war, which of course really changes the calculus in many ways. This is not something Russia could invade Ukraine because Ukraine doesn't have nuclear weapons. Russia didn't have to fear that. But likewise, I mean, it is it's a humanitarian catastrophe in Ukraine. But nonetheless, of course, nobody from the outside gets involved again because of nuclear weapons. So I think this is something we shouldn't underestimate. And again, when people say is the Russian military a paper tiger, again, it's a very it's senseless, really, because again, it's not only conventional military capabilities; it's also the nuclear capabilities where Russia can certainly rival the West. Or I don't think anybody is thinking about whether a nuclear war against Russia could be won or anything like that.
Thank you. I'll move on to the next one, which probably can be answered relatively briefly, is by Spud. Would it be fair to say the war evolves and that must be taken into consideration?
The war evolves?
Yeah.
Yes, of course it does. I mean, people constantly ask me, so how is this going to end? How will this war end? And so we just don't know at this point. It's very, very... We discussed all kinds of scenarios of how things might end, and everything, unfortunately, I have to say, is still in the open, ranging from. It's actually the problem is the definition of victory or defeat. Of course, the Russians in many ways have already lost this war. I would argue that as soon as the first tank rolled over the border, Russia lost this war because they cannot achieve the objectives they want to achieve. Also, this was by far a step too far. I think it will be impossible for the Putin regime to recover from this in the long term. But this doesn't mean that the war will be over anytime soon. Russia's inability to win this war, and Russia cannot win this war decisively, unfortunately doesn't easily translate then into Ukrainian victory or in Ukraine's ability to defeat Russia decisively. Because again, Ukraine, even if they manage, and I think there are hopes that this is the case, or if Ukraine manages to push Russia back to liberate its territory and so on, this of course does not mean that the problem is gone, because what the problem will only disappear once Putin or the leadership in Russia changes its mind about what they want from Ukraine, where their foreign policy is going, how they view Russia as an international actor. And there's absolutely no indication that this will happen right now. The war is evolving. Yes, I don't know what you mean by evolving. Also, of course, the Russians will be learning some lessons. Doesn't mean that they can be easily implemented, but again, both sides are learning. This will go on for unless something extremely unexpected happens. With this, of course, we cannot discard completely, like the possibility of regime change in Russia, potentially. I don't see much evidence of that, or not much hope for that, but you never know. This would be the only thing really that would bring the war to an end quickly. The best case scenario at the moment, I think, is more or less like a drawn out frozen conflict, unfortunately.
Thank you. Next question is by Ulf Jorgensen. It seems that Russia themselves overestimated their capabilities. Or can it be said that they are willing to take extreme risks to achieve their goals? My impression earlier was that they did not take such risk, but not sure now. So if so, does it make it more complicated to plan for future defense? So a lot of questions here. If you could be so kind as to answer it relatively briefly, because we're running out of time. So there's still a few more questions to go through, and especially this one because it's like 3 questions in one. So yeah.
Russia absolutely overestimated its military capabilities. I think Russia, like some Western policymakers, bought into the hype, looking at the big exercises and so on. Of course, the success from a Russian point of view in Syria and Crimea really played into that. Of course, traditionally, Russia has been a strong military actor. They had been playing up, of course, also the role the Soviet Union played in the Second World War. It just did not come into Putin's and the leadership's mind that they could lose a war against a country like Ukraine. It just did. And I'm reluctant to make comparisons, but look at the Vietnam War, for example, where also the US I'm not comparing the situation like for like, but also there was the expectation of a quick victory, and this idea that this superiority could be countered by a much numerically and technologically inferior opponent just did not really come into people's minds. Is Russia taking extreme risks? It seems like it, but again, I think this, of course, did not turn out the way as intended. Putin has few options now. He can admit defeat, or he can continue going and sort of adjust the mission and adjust the objectives so he can still portray this as a victory to himself. This is very important for his regime survival. So I wouldn't, from the Russian point of view, I don't think this war was seen initially, at least, as an extreme risk. So I don't think there's any worry that, from my point of view, at least, that Putin has gone completely crazy or rogue. I think this is not a useful way for looking at things.
Thank you.
But future defense, always problematic. Sorry, yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, absolutely. Moving on to the next question by Jerry Grefson. What is the relationship between the Russian military and groups like the Wagner Group? Is this ultimately helpful when there appears to be rivalry between the two or more groups?
Yeah, really good question. And of course, the Wagner Group and the so-called private military companies, it's something relatively recent to Russia. It was a long debate about, Russia doesn't have a law really even for private military companies. So the Wagner Group is, you could call it at best a semi-private or semi-state military organization. And this is becoming more and more clear. So they're training alongside, very close, they're training bases and so on to regular military units. It's clear, of course, that there are huge connections with Prigozhin and so on to the Russian leadership. How this has turned into a rivalry at this moment is it's something that everybody is keeping an eye on. This seems to be on the ground, or like Prigozhin sort of boasting that his Wagner soldiers are doing better than the regular armed forces, but I think this is overstated. Still, Wagner is part, essentially, for all intents and purposes, of the Russian state. So I wouldn't read too much into that. And in general, this idea that Prigozhin could become the next leader of Russia, I'm hugely skeptical about. He's the leader or creator of the owner of the Wagner Group.
Thank you very much. So a few more questions, like maximum 3, I think we're going to take, because we're running out of time. Now, Andrew Ludwig asks, are there general weaknesses within authoritarian regimes that lead almost inevitably to underperformance through corruption, lack of innovation, and inflexibility? And how reliably can this be factored into an analysis?
Yes, I think this is the case. At least if we look at all the research that is available, at least the Western research on military reforms, military innovation, and so on. This is one question I always asked, actually, people also when we looked at the Ukrainian military reforms, where actually the West and NATO and so on always emphasized the anti-corruption efforts, the need for more democracy, more transparency, and so on, saying that this is the key to an effective military. So when we spoke to NATO people involved in the training mission of Ukraine, I did ask this question and say, well, but if we assume that the Russian military has modernized and has caught up in terms of capabilities and so on, how does that sit with this kind of assumption? Because, of course, Russia is not a democracy. It is far from, and has even less so now than it was 20 years ago. Civil military relations, highly questionable, society military relations, and so on. And I think it turned out to be the case, of course, now when we look at the war in Ukraine, that Russia was not able to modernize its military into effective military force, and that buying some new equipment, some new kit, is not the same as modernization. That is something that you buy new kit, you have some new technology, but you don't have the organizational, the cultural changes and so on that come into it. And I said it earlier, it's impossible, I think, and it makes a lot of sense to me. It's impossible to have a modern, highly effective military which requires innovation, mission control, initiative, and so on, in a country that doesn't have any of these things in its political system and society, and where there's a lot of repression also and fear. It just doesn't make sense. And I think the war now in Ukraine is the best example for that, where Ukraine, that had been democratizing and really dealt with these issues, not completely, there are still issues outstanding, but nonetheless had really prioritized these things since 2014, turned out to have the much more functioning and much more effective military in the end.
Thank you. So now the last question, which you could theoretically answer by yes or no, but I think the person would like you to develop that a little bit. Glenn Narden asks, I do not believe that Russia's invasion was the primary objective. I mean, Ukraine's invasion, I guess. Ukraine is Asia's breadbasket, and I believe it was necessary to maintain Russia's growth, as well as a stepping stone to recover its former domination of Eastern Europe. Do you agree or disagree?
There's more than one reason for why. I think people like lots of students now are writing essay about why did Russia invade Ukraine and so on. It's never that simple. Various different reasons came into it. Yes, absolutely agree with you. This is what my book is also about. Russia, Putin in particular, is using the military as an instrument of great power politics, of course, maintaining its zone of influence in the near abroad, and Ukraine being particularly important is a part of that. It doesn't explain why they did that now and not 10 years ago, but it definitely comes into it. Also, opposition to the West and his year-long criticism of Western humanitarian interventions, military interventions, fear of the US monopoly on the use of force comes into it. So again, great power politics. Strategic interests also, of course, Ukraine is geostrategically important to Russia, especially Crimea, the Black Sea region, and so on. Standing up to the West again, this appeals to other countries in many ways, China, but also I think Putin's personality and his determination to get this done also plays into it. So I'm quite convinced by this. Putin has compared himself to Peter the Great. He's coming, he's getting older and so on. It would not surprise me at all with his megalomaniac tendencies that he also wants to go down in the history books as the person who recreated Greater Russia and so on. So it's not a single factor explanation for why Russia invaded Ukraine. There are also a lot of it's almost like hatred. People call it emotions in foreign policy. I think comes into it of the fear that Ukraine would have made a success of becoming democratic, moving closer to the West. Lots of different factors played into this. So yes, I absolutely agree with you.
Thank you. So I mean, if you see the comment section and also additional comments in the ask section, which are not actually questions, I think people have really enjoyed your talk and learned a lot, and would have liked, some people have commented they would have liked it to continue for longer. I would have liked the same, but we have to respect certain limits. And so, I would just like to thank you very much on behalf, I think, of everybody here, and of course the Royal Air Force Museum and the Center for War and Diplomacy for having given this talk, which was absolutely fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for listening.
I just wanted to echo those thoughts as well. Thank you from our end. Fantastic talk. And again, thank you to the audience for asking some brilliant questions, which kind of kept the discussion going in a very interesting way. So thank you, everyone. And I think that's probably all we have about time for. So thank you, Marco. Thank you, Bettina. And thank you to the audience. I'll see you next time.